artist, and he can do stuff on PowerPoint that I didn't know could be done. But he helped me with this one. And that's supposed to represent the oak of Mamre, or the terebinth tree that Abraham sat under. God's redemptive plan, lesson 5, a friend of God. God's redemptive plan. This is what Daniel came up with. He's an artist, like I said, and he does a lot of stuff on computers, so he's able to do a lot of artwork just even on a computer. But God's redemptive plan is likened to a master artist painting a picture. No artist ever just starts out with, boom, there's the picture, just right there. It just happens. He first comes up with a plan. He sees something in his head, and that's the way God did. Before the foundation of the world, he came up with this plan, and then you sketch out your main idea of the picture that you want to paint, and then you begin to refine that picture by adding colors, you block in colors, and then you start to add detail. So like this one, you start out with a little black and white sketch, and then you get some browns and some red, and then by the time it's done, you've got this really refined picture of the finished product. God's plan has never failed. Man has failed to have faith in God and His Word. And that's the most obvious reason that we can see today to trust God and His plan. Because as we get through these different phases of God's plan, people will say, well, that plan, he tried with Adam and that failed, so then he had to come up with a different way going through Seth, and then that didn't work out right, and so then he had Noah, and those are all different plans. But it's just the opposite of that. God's plan is the same from beginning to end. It's just man has failed to follow the plan. And so we see these different phases as we go through. Adam failed to trust and obey and basically said, I know good and evil, I want to try it on my own. Well, then we did man on his own last week, and that got us to Genesis 6, where every intention of the thoughts of every single heart were evil continually. Because God had taken a step back in the picture and let man try it on his own. But he steps back in and saves Noah and his household, starts things over again. And from Noah to the Tower of Babel doesn't seem like much changes. You still have man trying to do things on his own and make a name for himself. And so once again, God intervenes a little less forcibly this time. It just scatters people across the face of the earth. Once more, he gives grace and mercy to man.
I had to disprove that statement that God left man on his own.
Well,
Man
God never completely steps out of the picture, but we don't see him doing
steps out of
anything.
the picture. We walk out of the picture. He doesn't step out of the picture. He's always there for. He says that I will never leave
Yeah, you can do that. If we step out of the picture, then God's not
rebellion, not God's.
Okay. If we step out of the picture, God hasn't left us, we've left God, it's still man on his own.
Yeah, man's doing it on his own, but it's not God.
That's why I say God, it's not God's plan that's failed. Man has failed to trust and obey God, so he's stepped out of the picture. And we'll say it that way. God never left. God never leaves anybody. But
in fact, the God left man.
But we left, so it's still man on his own. Either way you want to look at it. And it's not really on his own because God uses the desert to be his own servant to do his own thing too. So he's gonna use whoever he wants to use, whether we'll decide to obey him or not.
God
Can still be used.
He's always doing something, we may not see it, but he's always doing
Right.
something.
Well, and that's what I'm saying. These people didn't see that. You know, you have people wanting to build the Tower of Babel up to the heavens to make a name for themselves. They're trying things on their own. God knows this isn't going to work. So he implements another detail into his plan of redemption. These people have failed to become a nation or failed to become what he wants. So he's going to take one man again. I'm going to choose one man, and I'm going to make him great, and I'm going to make him into a nation, and I'm going to give him his own land, and I'm going to bless all the people on the earth through him. I'm going to choose a man who will have faith in my word and in my spirit to guide him through his life and fulfill all the promises that I'm going to make to him. Does anybody know who was the first person to call Abraham a friend of God? The first recorded. I'm sure God must have been the first person that said, "You're my friend." But I know that passage came from James, about talking about Abraham's faith, and Abraham was called a friend of God. So then I did a word search in my Bible, and Jehoshaphat, the son of Asa, the king of Judah, in 2 Chronicles 20, he's getting ready to, he's presenting his case before God because Moab and a bunch of the Amorites and stuff were ganging up to beat on him, and he's not going to be able to defeat them. And so he's making his plea to God, and he said, Did you not, our God, drive out the inhabitants of this land before your people Israel, and give it forever to the descendants of Abraham, your friend? So clear back when Israel was just a nation, or just shortly after David, that we see this Abraham being called a friend of God. Abraham is also called the father of the faithful in Galatians 3:7. What else comes to your mind when you think about Abraham? I mean, his story goes from Genesis 12 all the way through 25:10. So there's a lot more material than I'm going to be able to bring to the table today, because there's a lot that went on in those 13 chapters.
One thing that stands in my mind is his age. And his life changed at a very late time in his life. And so, in a way, when men get older and they say, "I can't change," well, if Abraham did, why can't you? He was a man.
Yeah, he was an old man.
Just like we were. So we can change. And that's proof.
That's a very good point. Abraham didn't grow up in the church. Abraham was, well, he's only 10 generations away from Noah. He's the 10th generation from Noah. Somewhere in that time Babel happened. If that's a chronological genealogy that's given in that part of Genesis, of the generations from Noah to Abraham, then until about 40 years before Abraham was born. I was sitting there trying to do the math. Maybe he was still alive because he lived another 400 years, 405 years after the flood. But everybody started having kids in their 30s after the flood. So there was some old people stacking up. Social Security was taking a beating.
I believe the scripture says that they came out of idolatry. They came out of adultery. Abraham's father came from idolatry.
Yeah, it's odd in those early parts of Genesis, we don't really see the idolatry
You don't
develop
see it.
yet, but yeah, he came out of Ur of the Chaldees, so he was, we wouldn't call him an Arab now because Ishmael was going to be the father of the Arabs, but he came out of southern Iraq.
Well, a lot of what Moses did and God had him do, he named, all places by their name of the time of his life versus the name of when they were done. And that was because then people would
Recognize what it was. So when he says, when Moses writes Ur of the Chaldees, it's really the land of Shinar. It's actually where the Tower of Babel was built. So he was around when that, and I don't know when that was built or when in those 10 generations it was built and everybody was scattered. But we'll get into that in just a little bit. Another one, by faith, Abraham obeyed. That's one of the reasons he's called the father of the faithful. We learn that in Hebrews 11. And he believed God and it was counted to him as righteousness. Those are probably the three things that when we talk about Abraham, those are probably the three things. He obeyed and it was counted to him as righteousness. He obeyed by faith. So that's why he's called the father of the faithful. The two kind of go hand in hand. And then the other thing I thought of when he said, okay, because we've got this question and people have asked this question before, why Abraham? Why did he pick a Jew? Well, it wasn't a Jew when he picked him. But you got all these millions of people on the earth and you're looking down, you got to pick one. If you're going to do this plan, you got to pick one. Well, God in his foreknowledge knew, I guess, that Abraham would be an obedient, faithful person. So God chose him. That got me to ask another question. So what do you think that is? What about me? Did God choose me or did I choose God? What about you?
It's both.
Did you choose God or did God choose you?
That all. That is him.
Your free will, you have to choose God.
He chooses all.
He chose Abraham because he knew Abraham would choose him.
What did he say to the apostles in John 15 and 16?
Well, he says, have I not chosen you, but one of you has a devil. So it's not that speaking of the fact that he chose them, but only 11 of them chose him.
What did Jesus say to the apostles when he first met them?
That's cool.
Follow me. I chose you.
Yeah. but
What does he say to us?
The same thing.
Same thing,
Through the same thing.
but we still have,
If we didn't have this, if we didn't have the word of God, we wouldn't have chose God. This is what said, choose me.
You have to hear
Pick
the word.
between life and death, choose me. I don't know how he did that back then because, we didn't have King James. But he was communicating with heads of families, and somehow he conveyed to Abraham, choose me. You know, I'll show you, I'll make promises to you, follow me.
Well, he I would say that he apparently recognized something in Abraham's heart. That he was a sincere person, that he was a person of character, that he had qualities that would allow him to use him and accomplish what God set out to accomplish, or what God was trying to accomplish. And so Abraham very likely met those attributes that God was looking for. Not all men that lived then apparently did.
Yeah, I think you're right in that. And it seems to me as very much the same maybe as he chose Noah. You know, you've got all of these people that are just, every intention of their heart is evil continually. And
That didn't mean that there were not other men and women in the time that didn't believe in God. It's possible
Right.
that they were.
it's possible.
But to bring about a nation, he needed somebody special. And Abraham apparently was his selection because that was who he had to have to bring about what he was trying to do.
Psalm 33:12 says, "Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, the people he chose for his inheritance."
Yeah, I think that's right. You know, that if God had not chosen us, we wouldn't have known to choose him, even though we have that free will. And even with what Paul says, we're without excuse because we see God from his creation, from the power and the might and his divine abilities, that we are without excuse just from the stuff that's around us.
I found the passage where it says Nahor, they served idols, that's in Joshua 24. It says that they served idols. Terah, the father of Abraham, the father of Nahor, they served other gods. It's in Joshua 24.
Okay.
So that's,
Yeah, and that's where he came out of. Abraham came from Ur, well, what is called the land of Shinar, when we see the Tower of Babel being built. His father Terah is actually the one that packed up the family to go to Canaan. But they only made it as far as Haran on the banks of the Euphrates, about where Babylon is today. They made it as far as Haran and they settled down there. And that's where Terah died. And that's where Abraham was called by God to go to a land that he would show him.
these places, Ur and Haran, were sites of worship of the sun god, I believe it was. And they could go to either place. They go so far and worship the sun god still there in Haran.
Okay.
I remember that.
What was that? And Miss Beverly, Sister Beverly just read that God chose what scripture was that?
It's one of the
Psalm
Psalm
33:12.
33:12. 33:12.
So Abraham wasn't a perfect person. He wasn't. It was like, I guess he was like Noah. Noah found grace in the eyes of God. See grace again, God choosing Abraham. He could have chose any one of, the millions of people that were there, but this is the one in his foreknowledge who he chose. And so he calls Abraham, and Abraham went. It says, Abraham went just as the Lord told him, packed up everything. His nephew went with him, his wives, all of his stuff. And the first thing that he's got to do is cross a great big river. the Euphrates River at that point in Iran. Now, it's big today, we don't know what it looked like then, but that's where he gets his name Hebrew. Because Hebrew means from the other side. And he came from the other side of the Euphrates, or he came from the other side of the Jordan, depending on where that terminology may have come from, but he came from the other side of the river. And so that's when he became a Hebrew. Well, and they're starting, or God scattered them and gave them all different languages, and that's one of the reasons that they're scattered like they are. The Canaanites were in the land at that time, so they must have scattered them before that. It's kind of hard to figure out the timing in there because everything takes place within just a few paragraphs of a chapter. But anyway, when he left Haran, God made him some promises. Apparently before he ever left. Pick up your stuff and go. I'm going to make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you and curse, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed.
And from Moses' writings, it's evident that God was communicating directly with Abraham.
Yes. In visions or as a person face to face.
In some ways, we don't.
In that case, by this time, God isn't showing himself face to face with people from the way that I understand it. Except for we have the time when they had come together to go into Sodom and Gomorrah, the three men that are walking along. But he said that Moses was the only man that he ever talked to face to face. So however that works, whether it's the angel of the Lord or whether it's
He
God.
didn't reveal that. He just said God communicated.
Yeah. And
God spoke before. God wrote on the wall.
And we see him appear to Abraham in visions. And we see him in other places that he appeared to Abraham. And then after he got done talking, it says, and God went up from Abraham. So it almost sounds like he had some kind of physical presence there at times. But in some communicating to him, follow me, follow my spirit. And, he didn't talk to him but about 3 times in a period of 25 years that we have recorded. Now, I'm sure there were probably other times that he was, but I don't know that. And I can't imagine now only touching my Bible 3 times in 25 years. I know there's people that probably only do that 3 times in 25 years. But God is speaking to him and staying faithful that whole time without any kind of a word or any kind of guidance or direction, but just what God came down and spoke to you once. How many more times you really needed? So promises to start with, and really only one condition: go. Go to the land that I'm going to show you. If he'd have never gone, none of those promises would have ever come true. So, or at least through him, he wouldn't have made those promises to him wouldn't have come true. But he didn't. He made him these promises. He believed God would carry him out, so he went. He had no clue where he was going, it sounds like to me. But once he arrived, God made him another promise. I will give this land to your offspring. And then we see him walking about throughout the land, and then there's a famine in the land, and so he goes down to Egypt. He runs into a little bit of difficulty there in Egypt with the Pharaoh and Sarah. You all remember that story, don't you? And could never rationalize this in my head that he didn't flat out lie, but he didn't tell the whole truth, did he? He said, she's my sister. Well, she was his half-sister. We learned that later on in the Bible. She was his half-sister, the daughter of his father, but not the daughter of his mother. But he lied to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh was the one that ended up getting cursed, and Pharaoh's family got cursed because he took Sarah as his wife. And so then he kicks Abraham out of Egypt. Take your wife back. You should have told me that she was your sister, or that she was your wife. So then he returns to Canaan, and he returns with Lot and a whole bunch. In the meantime, they've become really wealthy. I've never understood that either, how they get kicked out of a country and you end up really wealthy getting kicked out of the country. They pay you to leave. And the two split up, and it's not until they split up, Lot goes to the Jordan Valley. He sees it as this nice, lush, green, wonderful valley for his sheep and all of his goods, and so he chooses the younger gets the choice of the best over the older. Lot should have let Abraham do the choosing. Abraham stays on the west bank of the Jordan in the land of Canaan. I'm sure that things look very different then than they do now, but if you had to choose between the two, the land of Canaan looks pretty good right now compared to the Jordan Valley, because after God got done with Sodom and Gomorrah, that all turned. But at that time, it was really a beautiful place, and that's where Lot had chosen. But once they split up, then God makes Abraham, and he says, I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that no one can count the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring can also be counted. Some more promises after the two of them split up. And your very own son will be your heir. Him and God are talking, and he says, what do you want me to do for you? And he said, I'm old now, and I don't have an heir. All of this stuff is going to go to, I think he was referring to Eleazar, his property manager or whatever. His number one guy. They weren't related, but that's who was going to get everything. Was not his heir. And God says, no, your very own son will be your heir. Apparently they'd been in the land about 10 years by that time. And so once again, without the information that he needed, Abraham was going to act but he wasn't patient enough, I guess, to wait for God's advice as to how that heir was going to come about, because they decide, well, Sarah says, I'm barren, so we're going to have to come up with another way of doing this, and here's my maidservant, Hagar, go into her and maybe we'll have an heir that way. That didn't turn out so good either. Not a lot of us probably make mistakes that will impact the world, or at least we won't know, that will impact the world in the future quite the way that Abraham's mistakes impacted the world today. But we see what happened with, they had Ishmael, and that was the wrong thing to do. Apparently he loved Ishmael very much, but Hagar had some problems with Sarah, and so he said, well, she's your servant, do with her what you want. And so she was really rough on her, and Hagar ran away, and the angel of the Lord talked to him and made her some promises and said he'd be a wild donkey of a man for the rest of his life, and he'll live up against his brothers all this time, and every hand will be against him and his hand will be against everyone else. And we still see that going on today. So, no bigger mistake than you and I, but think about the next time you make an error in judgment, that maybe you're going to affect the world 4,500 years from now with that error. And you might think twice about making that choice. If you knew your choices were going to affect the whole world in the next 4,500 years, then maybe we'd make better choices. I don't know. Anyway, yeah.
It tends to be what happens when we try to help God instead of letting God help us.
This is true.
And all the time, we see these stories of people, that can't be proven, that are kind of pretty well made up. It's like one day I read about a chicken supposedly in one of these, or a pheasant out in these fires, and having the chicks up under the wings out west, and the chicks surviving when they find it, and of course it's burned to death. Well, there's no such thing, it's not true. You hear Einstein's egg and everything. What happens when people figure out that that's a lie? You frame that as being from God and God doing it, but what happens when people find out about that's a lie? Because it's supposed Christians telling the story, trying to show the grace of God and the life of God, but then when people find out it's a lie,
It has a reverse
they
effect.
figure it's all a lie.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. So when we try to help God instead of doing as God said, it's always going to mess things up.
And I think that's why we have these stories, because we have a tendency to do that, don't we? We have this propensity that we've been given a lot of power because we have the power of choice. So, yeah, I can think of a better way to do this. If it's not God's way, it's not going to work. No matter how good of an idea it seems at the time, there's a lot of things that I've thought, wow, why did he do it this way? But then we see the end result, and that's why, that's, go ahead.
It's like sprinkling came about because of the idea that people near death that wanted to be saved, you couldn't baptize because that would probably give pneumonia and kill them, make them sicker. They were already so sick, you didn't want to kill them. So we'll sprinkle them and it'll be okay, and God will accept that. And now see what it's became. It
Then
went
you see
from
what
an exception to a rule, and it really never was an exception.
Musical instruments and things like that. Yeah, God, I would like to do. God should love this. This sounds really good. So, yeah, us thinking things up on our own, and as we discussed earlier, God never really leaves. He's always here. It's us who leave, and it's us who decide to go out on our own, but these stories show us why man needs redemption. That's why this plan from beginning to end is a plan of redemption, because it's stories of men trying to do things on their own without God and messing it up so bad that you finally either have to turn to God to get it to intervene and wipe a bunch of people in order to continue the plan from beginning to end. To show us in stories, and that's what the Old Testament is. It's stories of things that really happened that we know. They're not legends that have been passed down and modified and myths and things that we can't prove or things that we don't believe that are just made up. There's some things that are very hard to believe. 185,000 people in one night get killed is really hard to put your claws into. But we learn from the Old Testament the stories of what God did and how he dealt with people, the grace and the mercy that he showed because of the things that we try to do on our own, all in an effort to get back in. Is our effort to get back into his good graces, or is it an effort to make a name for ourselves? And so that's why this plan has worked from beginning to end, because every time we do like Abraham does, we decide to obey what God says, then in the end it works out. Sometimes it works out right from the very beginning, but we know that in the end that it's going to work out because God has told us that. So did God fulfill all of these promises? That's the next thing we have. When did these promises become fulfilled? In Hebrews, when he calls him the father of the faithful, what does it say? They all died without these promises ever getting fulfilled because they were looking for something better. Well, he became a great nation. He never saw it, but he became a great nation. Exodus 1, 9 and 10, Egypt said, these people are too great for us. They're more mightier than we are now. We need to do something in order to keep them down, because if we get in a battle, they're going to side with our enemies and then they'll overpower us and annihilate us. So by the time the Exodus starts, they are already a great nation. I think his name became great while he was still alive. I think his name became great after the Battle of the Kings, when the kings invaded Sodom and Gomorrah and took all of the people, and there was 6 kings against 5, and Abraham was on the underdog side of this. He had 310 fighting men, it says. But they routed these other 6 kings and brought back all of the people and all of the plunder. And Melchizedek came out to meet them. You remember how that story of Melchizedek, and that's one of those other things that I didn't have time to put into this, because there's so much information about Abraham. It's really incredible. But I think that's when his name became great, at least among people, because he was the one that led this defeat of all of these kings. The land promise wasn't fulfilled until after Joshua had finished going through the land and conquering it. And in Joshua 21, we learn where they said all of the land that God had promised to them that promise had been fulfilled. Yes.
You were talking about Abraham been making a mistake and it going on for 4,500 years. Actually, we're making the same mistake right now. in Galatians 4:22-31. It talks about how to treat the children of Abraham. They were from Hagar. But we don't. Nobody does that. But in verse 30, for instance, nevertheless, what saith the scripture, cast out the bondwoman and her son, for the son of the bondwoman shall not be heir with the son of the. So then, brethren, we are not children of the bondwoman, but of the free. It starts out at 22. It's
Uh-huh. Yeah, like comparing, by that time, they're comparing the spiritual children of Israel to the physical. You're not a child of the physical, you're a child of the spiritual. And don't have anything to do with that past, going back to that old law, going back to that old way of life and everything. This is a new one. And God will develop this through this plan. We will begin to see that it is, after you've gone through the whole Bible, you can see patterns of him taking us from the physical to the spiritual. That's why didn't Jesus come right after Adam sinned? You ask questions like that, because there had to be a time of history for us to learn that the physical way of doing things isn't the right way. The spiritual, God is spirit, and those that are going to worship him have to worship him in spirit and in truth. And so Jesus, in the fullness of time, when the physical was, this is as far as man's going to get on his own. Then he sent Jesus. And now Jesus, even in his stories, started with physical parables and moved to spiritual meanings. And it always is this move from physical to spiritual, trying to show us that spirit is always stronger than flesh. And to follow a spirit God who you can't see, who you can't touch physically, but you have his word and you can trust it. Yeah.
There's that point of man has always been somewhat superstitious. And if you go back and you look at the history of the Old Testament and you read through it, you see God sometimes using that superstition to get man along a certain path. Following it. A lot of the Old Testament worship is done and to accommodate the superstition as well as the spiritual. And people don't really, and a lot of people are still trying to hold on to the superstition part of that today. If you go back and you read 2 Kings 18 or 19, when Naaman goes to Elisha to get healed of his leprosy, he expected Elijah to come out, say something, wave his hand over a superstition moment. So look, whereas God trying to say, I'll tell you what to do, but it's me that's doing the healing. Naaman realized it wasn't the rivers of Jordan that healed him. It was God healing him because he did what God told him to do.
And that superstition, though, and that's another thing, that in that superstition, where'd that come from? That didn't come from God. That was man teaching his kids dumb stuff instead of teaching his kids the word of the Lord and raise your children in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord, teaching the kids what God says and how God does things. We wouldn't have so many of these crazy ideas because we didn't learn that from God. We learned that from our fathers, and that's why we make them. Part of the reasons why we make the mistakes that we do, because given a choice, we choose what my dad taught me, what my mom taught me, rather than what the Sunday school teacher and taught me from the Bible. Larry.
The Mosaic law, God, I mean, when Moses, he gave him all the new laws, you know, the 10 Commandments, set out a set of rules, what man should do. And then over the years, the priests and the different ones, they kept adding things to it, more stuff, more here, more there. That when Jesus come, it was time for Jesus to come, because, you know, when he went to the temple, he overturned the tables. He kind of got angry the way they're doing things. He said, this is not the way God wanted this house run.
And we can see that in our own life.
Yeah.
We can see that in our own life. We got a constitution. We got a set of laws that are set out that would make life pretty simple and easy to do. Not easy. It's hard. Life is hard.
Yeah.
But we come up with, I got a better idea.
Yeah.
You know, that, I want to make a name for myself, so I'm going to come up with a better idea than what those guys did. Those guys are just men. Well, that doesn't, we've seen how that works out. Number of other promises that he fulfilled. We just got a couple of minutes left. Numerous as the dust. David said in 2 Chronicles 1:9, you have made this people as numerous as the dust. Bless those who bless you. In Numbers, he repeated that. Moses did. And then all these promises were fulfilled by early in the nation of Israel. By the time Israel was an early nation, they had been fulfilled, except for one. All of the families on the earth will be blessed because of you. But Israel remembered that promise, and so they kept trying to become a mighty nation so that they would rule over all of the nations of the world, and that's how they thought that was going to be, I guess, because they had to do it. All of the promises were made to them, so all of the things that are going to get done there have to be gotten done through us. And so we see that that didn't come until they finally realized this isn't going to work. Promises and covenants. God made a couple of covenants with Abraham, and it had to do with early on the land promise. When he made a covenant for the land promise, it was an unconditional promise. The following, this next part has no scriptural support, but it comes from secular sources. The ceremony that they went through involved cutting two animals in half and passing between those two halves. We see him giving Abraham that command to cut these up and lay them opposite of each other. Not all covenants apparently were made like this, only really serious ones, because the one who walked past the two halves put their life on the line, that if they didn't fulfill their part of the covenant, or didn't fulfill the covenant. So what's interesting is just before the sun went down, God put Abraham into a deep sleep. And God passed through the two halves, binding himself and putting his name on the line to the fulfillment of that covenant. So that's a covenant that's never going to be broken because God cannot lie. Then we see in Genesis God's promise of these promises are going to continue. My promises are going to continue, but they're going to continue through Isaac, not through Ishmael. And so at that point is when he gave him the covenant of circumcision, even though Ishmael was circumcised, the promises were going to come through Isaac. And then Abraham tested, and we're out of time. But we know how that tests. Take your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and offer him as a burnt offering. And he did that just the way that God said for him to do that. And then God said, because you have obeyed my voice. So we see the redemptive plan. Blessings were going to come to those who have faith in a spirit God. And the good promises of God, God fulfills all and bad. But the good promises of God are only fulfilled through those who obey his voice.
Hey, Ron, I just want to put something out there that's of significance. Abram, he was Abram, that man
He could
exalted
have called
father.
10,000 angels song.
And because he was an exalted father, God named
I
him
don't know the name.
Abraham, because now he was exalted, now he's going to be a multitude, a father of a multitude. So that's significant.
Yeah, there's a lot more. There's a lot more to Abraham. There's a lot.
Yeah, but that right there is very significant. Exalted father, because he's exalted, father of a multitude. He was faithful, so that's significant. The name and why he was named Abraham, why his name was Abraham.
It even fits into that type, anti-type.